So my name's Tracie Troxler, and I'm with Sunshine Community Compost. It's a nonprofit that focuses on engaging communities around composting, resource recovery, and zero waste. And I work on the west coast of Florida, and I'm here on the east coast working to expand the impact of composting in this region as well through partnerships. It's really helpful to communicate about composting before we get into the act of composting so that people understand the benefits and what it is in the first place. So composting is the aerobic decomposition of organic materials in the presence of oxygen by microbes. And really the important part about composting that people don't always realize is the importance of microbes and how microbes create and benefits in soil with the soil life. And there's a lot of benefits to composting, and we're going to talk a little bit about those over the next couple of minutes so that you understand how good composting is. And there's a lot of different ways to compost. There's a lot of methods, there's a lot of systems, there's a lot of types, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And some of the benefits, just from a high level perspective, is that it first of all, it increases the life of your soil, and you really want soil working with your plants. It also reduces the food scrap waste that goes into the landfill and creates methane emissions and impacts climate change. Also, when you use compost, you can reduce the amount of fertilizer that you're using, and that can have some downstream impacts in terms of water health and community health. And composting also, it just brings people together. There's a lot of ways that community composting in particular brings folks together to create local food. So those are just some high-level benefits. So one important thing that we want to talk about is how composting is related to climate change. So there's a lot of human activities that we do that increase the heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. And one thing that's valuable about composting is that we can actually reduce the heat trapping gases, the human impacts towards climate change. And so, as I was mentioning in the beginning, when we take our food scraps and we put them in the landfill, they get compacted, they get compressed, they get covered and mixed up with all the other garbage, and they go into an anaerobic process, and that is a process that creates methane. And methane is a very potent greenhouse gas emission, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so we have an alternative where we can compost and put food scraps into an aerobic process, and that reduces the impacts of those methane emissions. And with climate change, we're seeing those human impacts, create situations from a global scale that, they're increasing storm systems, increasing sea level rise, increase in ocean acidification. There's a lot of troublesome things that are happening as a result of climate change, and any actions we can do to reduce that, such as composting in our backyard or in our community, can promote positive outcomes towards climate change. Composting is related to methane emissions, as we were talking about, related to the landfill. So if we take our food scraps, we put them in our backyards, we put them in our communities, and we put them into oxygen-rich conditions where they can decompose, we'll end up with nutrient-dense soil food. When we put them in the landfill and mix them with all the other garbage, we get methane emissions. And we know that methane emissions from the landfill are the third highest level of emissions are coming from around methane or coming from the landfill. So we have an opportunity to shift our behavior and shift some global impacts. And also, composting is related to altered nutrient cycles. So when we do things like mine for phosphate, basically when we're mining for phosphorus, we're creating phosphate mines. And the process of phosphate mining, it breaks apart the nutrient cycle in addition to creating some toxic byproducts such as heavy metals. And so from there, our fertilizers end up in our landscapes, which many times are not being taken up and integrated into the landscape, into the garden, into the farm, and they're running off with water events. And the runoff of those nutrients are going back into the watershed and increasing the nutrient concentrations in the watershed, which can then throw off balances in the water. So we see things like algae blooms as a result of some of those nutrient cycling imbalances. And so alternatively, if we use compost to feed our soil, to feed our plants, instead of fertilizers to feed our plants, we are able to reduce some of the impacts of those altered nutrient cycles. for me, one of my favorite parts about composting is the community aspect. So what we do, our organization sets up community compost sites in the community. And so we end up seeing all these benefits where people are coming together, they're depositing their food scraps in community sites, and they're meeting each other while they're doing it. They're also creating opportunities to grow local food. And there's opportunities for creating green jobs, there's opportunities for greening the neighborhood and more local food production and more local soil production. And that's something that is really inspiring for me. When we see people that never met before meet for the first time, who've always lived in the same neighborhood, meet for the first time at a compost bin, we know that we're having some positive community benefits. And also around youth education, composting, microbes, bugs, it's a perfect way to engage youth. So there's a lot of community benefits when you're doing community compost projects. So this particular project, we worked with and are working with a number of partners. The Opelika Community Development Corporation is working with Health in the Hood to help create an urban farm and opportunities to grow food in urban settings that can also create the possibility of educating residents and the possibility of jobs. Okay, and so basically there's a lot of different ways that you can compost. Like you can compost by buying bins, you can compost by creating your own do-it-yourself bins, you can compost by using a worm system, just a simple food scrap system, or even a fermentation, a bokashi fermentation process. So there's lots of ways that you can compost. And you'll find your own way as you start learning about composting. And what's really important is that we make a shift from considering food scraps and a lot of other resources as waste. We have to transition from a waste mindset to a resource mindset. So food scraps are really a resource that haven't been integrated into the system, and that's what we want people to be thinking about. And so some of the things when we're doing a community compost site is we have people, they collect their food scraps in a little bucket, and then they take those food scraps, they put them in their fridge or their freezer or under their counter, and then they bring it to a community compost site or they bring it to their backyard. And in either one of those systems, it's a way to recover the nutrients that are in those scraps and create a compost product. And some of the different kinds of bins, so people have these backyard bins that they'll use. We have community site compost bins where there's multiple bins. One is where you deposit, the other ones are curing. And then there's vermicomposting bins, and then as we were mentioning before, there's also a bokashi fermentation process. And you just have to start finding your path and looking at what system makes the most sense for your situation, whether you're in a house or an apartment, or you're a student, or you're working in a garden. You just find your way towards what system works best for you. And in terms of do-it-yourself bins, so there's a lot of resources in the community that can be used to create compost bins. And we see commonly, we see pallet bins where people find pallets that haven't been treated and they use them as a system for collecting food scraps and using compost. We see people using garbage bins and drilling holes in them so there's aeration opportunities. We see people using metal bins. There's all kinds of ways that you can create your own system. And with a worm bin, we see people using plastic storage containers and the same kind of thing. So it doesn't matter, you don't need a lot of resources to compost, you just need some creativity and a view of your community and how you can recover resources. And the process for composting, so this is one of my favorite parts. It's basically you're taking 4 or 5 main ingredients and making a lasagna with them, more or less. So the ingredients that are most important for composting are greens, which are your food scraps. We call them greens. They're not always green in color, and that's your nitrogen source. And then browns, which is your carbon source, which is wood or straw or chips or old leaves that are browned out. Those are 2, that's the nitrogen and the carbon, and then you need air and water. And with those 4 ingredients, you invite microbes in. You're basically making a meal that inspires microbes to show up and start the decomposition process. So, and when I say greens, so when we're setting up a system, we're trying to recover food scraps. And so some of the food scraps that we want and don't want, I'll let you know about. So food scraps we want vegetable material, we want fruit material, we want anything that was a seed. For instance, bread was a wheat berry, or rice was a grain. So those are all fine materials to put in your compost bin. tea, that's material. And then also we don't want fats, we don't want dairy, we don't want things that are going to attract other critters. So that's something that we want to be mindful of when we are creating our compost. Basically, in addition to food scraps being a resource, also remember your recycling is a resource. So we want to get our clean plastic, aluminum, metals into the recycling bin so those can also have a second, third life. And we think about waste again as a resource. So basically, human-derived problems can be addressed by human-derived solutions, and composting is a human-derived solution. So we just really want people to understand all the opportunities and the benefits of composting and to participate and remember that we're all in this together and we can compost, starting with your next meal.